Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So, Professor Emery, first, at the first meeting this committee had, we heard from officials. They mostly said they didn't know anything, but they did mention in their opening statement that the cap and the other policy measures that were introduced were because of unsustainable growth. That's the quote from them. And to reduce student vulnerability. In your opening statement, you talked about the goals that the government may have had. Could you talk about what do you think the goals the government had in putting on the cap, and whether do you think those are the right ones, or do you have different goals that should be reached?
Professor
So
Emery.
I'm going to focus my response from the perspective of the Atlantic region, which I think has a different context from, I think, the cap, which was addressing more of an Ontario-centered problem with the massive growth, particularly in colleges. Atlantic Canada has had increasing dependence on international students, but not at the same rate as the rest of the country. And in New Brunswick in particular, it's only been the last couple of years that we've seen what I would even call large growth, but it's not particularly large compared to what you see in some cities in Ontario. So as a consequence, the challenge with the cap is that the first mover, Ontario, has done a lot of this expansion in a way that it seems like it's had some pretty negative consequences. So the cap, in a sense, makes sense for Ontario, maybe for the large cities, but it is hamstringing the opportunities for other regions like Atlantic Canada to sort of test the waters to see, are the students more effective for staying?
Thank you, Professor Emery. I'm just going to interrupt you. I wanted to ask you then, do you think a one-size-fits-all policy for all of Canada is the right approach then?
Of course not. But it's the one that has often been used for a number of things, including climate policy. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we get a one-size-fits-all policy, because that's sort of what sells across Canada, but it doesn't work for the Atlantic region.
So, Professor Emery, do you think this is going to harm Atlantic Canada and its universities and college systems?
I think it will put a lot of strain on the university and college systems in terms of the labor market. It's not clear to me what the bottom line impact will be, because we also depend on in and out migration, which could include international students from other regions.
So, Professor Emery, do you know if any of the governments or the universities or colleges were consulted before these changes were introduced?
I'm not privy to those kinds of conversations, so it wouldn't be fair for me to speculate what role they might have had.
My next questions are Professor Worswick. I was going to ask about this absorptive capacity that you spoke about. Do you have suggestions on how that would be calculated?
I mean, I think what I'd like to do, I actually submitted a grant application on Friday, and what we'd like to do is use the surge of the population we've seen over the last 7 years to try to estimate it empirically. But I think that there are things you could do without going to that much trouble. Like, people have compared growth in the housing stock to the growth in the population. So if you see that housing is not growing proportionally with the population, that would be, a sign that that this could be an issue.
So you mentioned at the end of your opening statement the case of fraudulent applications at the Immigration and Refugee Board, but there's also other instances of fraudulent activity. We learned at the last meeting of this committee that up to 10,000 fake acceptance letters fraudulent acceptance letters were identified by IRCC. So this was, big business. They said that it was only in 1 year. This is only after they had introduced this two-step or another layer of security on it. Do you have any other concerns that all these changes that introduced has led to more chaos in the immigration system, and especially in the processing of applications?
I mean, I think that when you change policy and programs too often, there's going to be confusion and uncertainty. But I think there was an issue of just the volume of people coming into the country. And so I think cutting back on the volume coming in is probably going to help. But it isn't really my area of expertise. So.
Speaking again back to absorptive capacity, there's a lot of people that, and again, you mentioned in opening statement, there's a lot of individuals who are seeing their work permits expire, their study permits expire, they don't have an opportunity for renewal, so they're choosing to, and this is being reported in the news, that they're choosing to go and make applications to the Immigration Refugee Board. Does that speak to anything else in like more chaos? Will we see that keep growing and there'll be even more questions as to the absorptive capacity of Canada, where you will have people who will be waiting perhaps years before they'll know whether they'll get permanent status in Canada, and all the uncertainty related to it, the types of jobs that they will take on, the survival jobs they'll take on in the meantime?
Mr. Worswick.
I think ideally you would want an international student system, temporary foreign worker system, where the people coming in realize that they're here temporarily and they would leave if they're not eligible for permanent residency. I think what you're saying is true, that there obviously are processing limitations. So, I mean, one could consider extending the work permits, I think, temporarily, given this, that, again, this isn't really my area of expertise, but it strikes me that we are in a moment of tremendous expansion of our international mobility programs, and we're now trying to ratchet them back down. I would not be averse to saying maybe extend these permits for a year or two, but you know, beyond that, I think either the immigration system should be able to process all these applications, or people should be leaving if they no longer have a legal right to stay in Canada.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kamich. And I will go to now MP Ali for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My question is to Mr. Worswick. As you know, last month, our government introduced that reduction in permanent resident numbers and published population targets for temporary migrants for the first time. And in the Global Mail news article, you recently wrote, you described these changes as, quote, sensible response to the evolving immigration and macroeconomic situation in Canada, end quote. Could you elaborate for this committee on your views to these recent changes, as well as changes made earlier this year to Canada's international student program? Could you also expand on what your recommendations would be for the federal government to consider ensuring integrity in the system?
Professor Worswick.
The first parts are maybe easier for me. I think we've not had limits on a lot of temporary migration pathways in the past, and I think that's proven to have been a mistake. I think we should always have targets and limits because of this concern about absorptive capacity. And I would admit it's a notion that immigration economists have been talking about for decades, but it's not that well defined. And to get at Professor Emery's point, there might be a different absorptive capacity than there in Halifax than there is in Toronto. It could well be a regional thing, especially if it's rents that we're concerned about. I mean, I've been very critical of the government allowing the situation to expand to the point where, you know, we have in 2024 July, we had 7.27% of the population were temporary migrants. I mean, to put it in perspective, the foreign-born population of the United States is 14%. So we have equivalent of per capita half the immigrant of any age, any vintage population in the U.S. are now temporary residents of Canada. So I was responding to the changes in policy. They made sense. I think this is the direction we have to go. It's an unfortunate circumstance, but that's the situation. Again, on the integrity of the system, I'm an economist. I'm not a public administration expert, so maybe I'll stop there and answer other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Worswick. Go to honorable member.
Thank you, through Chair. My observation, because I represent a riding in Brampton Centre, had a chance that there's an encampment or protest by international students. I had the opportunity to visit their camp. And then Professor Emery was talking about different provinces in Ontario. There's a migration that's of students from one province to another province. For example, they came into different province and then they moved to different institute and transferred them to different province. Do you think the provinces, they had a role to play to balance it out, not approving those camps or satellites or mergers in the different areas?
So you're referring to like the satellite
Yes.
campuses. It's a good question. I mean, I don't tend to blame the institutions. I don't think universities and colleges have staff members who are trained as economists necessarily to be able to think about this. I think it's definitely, the federal government has a responsibility. I think the provincial governments have some responsibility. I think this went off the rails, and I think it's either or both, depending on how you think about it.
Another question through chair. You have described our government's recently announced immigration level plans as a quote, return to the previous levels of immigration to Canada, end quote. From your perspective, how might this shift and the recent shift to the international student program contribute to the integrity of Canada's immigration system?
I think that these changes were needed. So, both on the immigration front, the temporary foreign worker front, and the international student front. The international student was probably the most problematic sector in the sense that it had grown the most. And so I think the targets are, I think our challenge right now is we have a stock of temporary residents in Canada that's very large. And so, I mean, I watched the Prime Minister's video, I guess it was released on the weekend or maybe late last week, and they were relating it to the long-run trend of the population and trying to get back. And I think that's not a bad way to think about it, is to say, we're way off trend. How do we get back to it? Well, one way is to let the temporary resident visas expire. The people who aren't eligible for permanent residency go home or on to somewhere else. And then we get back to a sustainable system. So that all makes sense to me.
30 seconds on
I'll pass it on to you if you wanna. Like on that, your article, I just quote that reduce the pressure on your housing and healthcare sectors. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more based on your expertise on
15
that?
seconds, Professor Worswick.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming out of the COVID pandemic, we knew the healthcare system was severely constrained, and then we brought in 1 million or 2 new people, and very few of them are able to work in the healthcare system. So it's hard to see how the healthcare system was going to expand. So cutting these numbers back makes sense.
Thank you very much, honorable member. First of all, I honor, before I go to the next round, member, I appreciate if once you start the question, before you start questioning, if you can mention who the question is referred to, because of the online, the two of the witnesses can't see our face expression. That is respected. Appreciate that. With that, Mr. Bruneau for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. My question is for Mr. Collier. First of all, you talk about the presence of international students in your institutions come with its own challenges. You are telling us that the Quebec universities are assuming their responsibilities. Can you give us examples of measures that you have established to do this? Yes, thank you for the question. I think that everyone is aware that the growth of international students, even if in Quebec, there is significant growth, but it is not uncontrolled growth, but it can be a challenge. And I'm thinking of the agencies that send mass letters. I think there were 99,000 applicants received, which was an increase of 26%. Obviously, not all students are admitted. Out of those 99,000 applications, and I'm thinking of UCO, the University of Quebec in Outaouais, where they received 34,000 applications, and 431 were eligible and 555 were registered. And there were a number of components that we're working on and our responsibilities. We saw recently in the media there were asylum seekers, and the universities assess academic files and there is a increased candidates from the provincial and federal governments, but we try to ensure that students accepted to our institutions have serious academic plans. They come to study, and we have a number of institutions have assess the applications, and we ensure that we short circuit the agency somewhat, and that we assess the seriousness of the candidates' plans, and we also have an encyclopedia of all of the institutions around the world and the qualities of those institutions, and we also have an IT system that ensures that we can make sure that the diplomas are not counterfeit, and unlike bad actors outside of Quebec, who are mainly outside of Quebec, we don't use immigration as a business model. We look at the seriousness of their academic plans, even if obviously the system is not perfect, but we are working on it. Thank you. You mentioned in your introductory remarks about pan-Canadian measures and that were made here in Ottawa. Perhaps there is a misunderstanding of the education system in Quebec, which is different from what is done elsewhere in Canada. So I'll take, for example, the measure of postgraduate permits. Does that affect you? And is there a dissonance between a measure that is meant for all of Canada, but which is perhaps demonstrating a misunderstanding of the system in Quebec? In Quebec, we have a specific system with the Ministry of Post-Secondary Institutions, and there are post-diploma work permits and then before master's and PhD students were exempt from the changes, and there are programs that exist in a number of municipalities in Quebec, and they'll be impacted by this measure to change it for masters and PhDs as well. And that can have an impact on registration numbers, but the universities are developing programs with a 5, 10, 15-year lens, and we can't change things overnight. So if we look specifically at the case of the TESS, in some institutions, we collaborate with diplomas, teaching diplomas, to address labor shortages in the education system in Quebec, and they seek to address labor shortages that we're experiencing currently. And if there are programs that were developed, there's small universities that are anchored throughout the regions, and they are very rooted in their communities. And these are programs that are most of the time developed in collaboration with local communities by reflecting on the local needs of those communities. And pan-Canadian measures are ill-adapted to take into account the local realities of those communities. And these institutions are really rooted in those small communities. If there is a sector that is needed in Community X and it's not on the federal government's priority plan, we may have literal failures because in some regions, the graduation classes are relatively small, and it may mean that the graduating class will not address labor shortages, or they won't have access to the courses they need. So these measures are very difficult to adapt to the specificity of each region, particularly in Quebec. Already? Oh, okay, I'll try to come back to you, Mr. Coloré. Thank you very much. It was great.
We will do now, we will go to, before we go to MP Quan, after MP Quan, we will give 2 minutes to Conservatives, 2 minutes to Liberal, 1 Bloc, 1 NDP, and then that's it. So MP Quan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before our committee today. My question is for Dr. Emery. In a podcast that came out in and around November 7th, I think, There were comments that I think you and your co-host had made about the decision that the government had announced with respect to the immigration levels plan and the international students changes. And they were somewhere along these lines that they were more of a political response and that the government was doing things that are politically expedient in the short run just to take the heat off of the current government. I wonder if you can expand on that comment with respect to that about the decision with the international student changes.
Sure. So the challenge is that, again, I should have been a bit more careful about inferring motive on the part of government, but I will say the lack of study, the lack of discussion prior, and sort of the speed with which those caps came in on the heels of crises like affordable housing and things like that, perception of bad actors in Ontario, growing intense pressure in Ontario universities and colleges for finances. The fact that it happened so quickly without study, without this kind of consultation prior, to me, it seems there's been more discussion after what have the impacts been. That was behind a lot of those comments. And it's also the case in the Maritime region. A lot of the discussion around immigration numbers and the role of international students, it wasn't being studied in terms of absorptive capacity or some of those factors like Dr. Worswick has brought up. It was really just, we need more numbers. And this goes back to 2016 when the idea of just growing international students, immigration numbers in total, was also in a politically expedient way to try and grow the regional economy because there was no clear evidence that it was going to work in a small open economy. You need to stimulate labor demand to get population up. You can't push it by increasing labor supply. So we've had a period of at least 10 years where governments tend to study things after they make the policy decision instead of advance. And so that's part of why I believe a lot of these things are reactionary and they tend to be changes made when things don't go as expected.
Very much. I really appreciate those comments. Now, this has been said already by others that seem to indicate that the government's decision is just a political response to which the housing crisis, by the way, is not necessarily caused by newcomers, but by successive governments, successive Liberal and Conservative governments who's failed on the delivery of housing that people need. Now, I won't expand on that. I've saved that for another day. But people are also saying that, and they fear that there would be this unanticipated consequences as a result of these decisions and the announcement that the government has made. And you touched on your podcast about, and I quote, "We're about to see a lot of dominoes fall like the financial crisis about to hit a lot of the Ontario post-secondary system, and this is going to have a knock-on effects like firms aren't going to find workers, so plants are going to close or threatening to close." So I wonder if you can share with the committee about your thoughts on the broad economic impacts of the international student caps for different provinces and different regions, and particularly those are in rural regions or smaller communities, what those implications might be.
So when you have a Canadian economy, which is increasingly urbanizing around a small number of very large cities and centers, and you have a large number of traditional industries, say like fishing, agriculture, that are being hollowed out in terms of traditional working age population, they are aging more rapidly than the cities. Getting workers into those regions to maintain production in plants which are not investing in automating, they remain highly dependent on labor. That's where, again, a lot of these decisions around immigration was coming through as a reaction to the lack of investment we see in Canada in advanced manufacturing, in automation. We're keeping the legacy plants going by finding a new supply of labor to replace the traditional younger Canadian labor supply, which was no longer there. The challenges in Ontario with their post-secondary system are different than the challenges we're facing, let's say, with labor supply needs in the Atlantic region. And so in Ontario, I don't know if they were planning to use the increase in college-educated, let's call it personal service workers coming out to solve some of the healthcare problem like they were in Atlantic Canada. But the direct ties in the college system in our region, we're looking at programs that would produce graduates that could go to work in, say, the care sector. So there was at least some thinking, I think, around how do we find the care workers for the population that isn't getting access to the services they need. But again, there was no study in advance on does that work. It was based on a belief that you train them, the jobs will be there and they'll take the jobs. But it's a rambling answer. But the real reason I think we did a lot of this was the labor shortage narrative that came in. A lot of employers were struggling to make ends meet with a lot of the margins and labor market policies coming in. If you can't raise your wages, you need to find another supply of labor to keep the lights on. And I think that's what was happening in a lot of places.
So, can I just make one quick comment? In other words, to summarize that, is to bringing in cheap labor. And now that the government has another crisis, they want to blame the people that were brought in to provide cheap labor on the crisis that the government themselves created.
Thank you, MP Quan. And now we will go to Mr. Reddy Cobb for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Worswick, I just wanted to clarify something. You talked about when we bring immigrants in, we should be raising the average skill level. You talked about average wages and things like that. And you seem to imply to me that universities, for sure, colleges, and private, not often. What about polytechs and some of the jobs that are, like some of the trades jobs and some of the areas where we have great needs and wages are very good? Are you saying that we shouldn't be bringing people in for that?
No, I mean, what I'm sort of suggesting is we should make the decision for allocation of international visas to higher education institutions based on expected earnings. So if the polytechnics you're talking about, if the graduates have high earnings, then we should allocate international student visas to them. And maybe there are programs at universities that don't meet that criteria. I think we need to sort of, the way we use the comprehensive ranking system for immigration, I think we should try to develop something that's similar for international students. Because otherwise, I just think lobbying and politics are going to just drive this, and we're going to end up placing international students in the wrong institutions. And I do think we have absorptive capacity issues. So I think we're constrained in that regard. Our healthcare system just can't expand fast enough to handle the kind of volumes of people coming in that we've had.
1 minute, Mr.
Thank you. Mr. Emery, the Prime Minister talked about bad actors taking advantage of the programs, essentially blaming the problems in the immigration system on bad actors. He talked about too many colleges and universities using international student programs to raise their bottom lines. He talked about scammers targeting vulnerable immigrants. Do you agree with the Prime Minister that it was the designated learning institutions, the universities and colleges essentially, they're to blame for the fraud and the errors that happened in this program, or does the government bear some blame in this?
30 seconds, Mr. Emery.
It sounds to me like there's been a failure of oversight in the implementation of who had the right to invite students in. I don't believe universities were abusing it to the degree we saw in some of those private colleges. So I think it's a regulatory failure or a policy failure.
Okay. Almost done. Thank you. Okay, just 1 second, according to my watch. I would love to welcome Mr. Chang to the committee, but as I know you are probably want to ask a question, but unfortunately I have to go to Mr. Chang for 2 minutes. Mr. Chang, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, my question is directed to Mr. Colorette. In a 2021 study, economist Pierre Fortin found Quebec would have to invest an additional $1.4 billion per year in universities to bring their funding in line with that of other Canadian provinces. Given reports that provinces underfunded their post-secondary institutions, leading to an over-reliance on international students' tuition. In light of this, don't you think the recent federal changes to the international students program were a direct result of provinces not adequately addressing the needs of post-secondary institutions? And also, And do you have other recommendations for the committee to consider, especially in light of Quebec's jurisdiction on immigration and the bill regarding international students?
Mr. Corley.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. I think that, well, Mr. Fortin, the economist that you cited, is quite right. The universities have a chronic underfunding issue in Quebec. And the University of Quebec last year tabled a budget brief to the government of Quebec where we talk about historic delays of $100 million, and we need equivalent funding to other universities. Each year we accumulate significant debt, but I would remind you that for the Quebec University of Quebec network of universities, for the University of Quebec, we charge roughly $21,000 a year. For Quebec students, we receive $18,000. And in terms of pedagogy and welcoming services for our network at the University of Quebec, we need to undo the myth that they're a cash cow, that they bring in a lot to the universities, because in the specific case of the University of Quebec, that is not the case. In terms of what the federal government could do to improve the situation, well, the answer is relatively difficult. What the government of Quebec is currently doing, it is adding to the level of complexity, because the federal government acts and the province of Quebec does different things, and we're caught in the middle. And it's certain that if we want to improve the situation, if we want to keep universities viable, I think that the federal government should, at minimum, take into consideration the Quebec context and exclude superior education from Quebec. That would be a minimum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corley and Mr. Chang. We went overtime on this one. Mr. Bruneau for 1 minute, but I will.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick. You talked earlier that about 50% of international students do post-secondary institution studies. How will the federal government affect this? 50% of our students are postgraduate, but what's more telling is that we have 8,000 post-secondary students or graduate studies, but the scientific research depends on the presence of these postgraduate students. Professors work with them. They work in laboratories. They're the ones who produce research in collaboration with professors. The entire innovation system relies on international graduate students. It's so important that in some programs, professors at the University of Quebec are not able to launch research projects because they don't have enough graduate students. So 40% of our international students are graduate students, and we don't know right now what will happen to them. But there will be an innovation problem particularly within the University of Quebec. Thank you. Thank you.
So we will go to MP Quan for 1 minute. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to go back to Dr. Emery. I still remember actually when the government announced the Atlantic Province's special immigration measure back in those days. So given that this is where we are now with this situation, do you have any suggestions or recommendations of how the government should adjust their plans, especially in addressing the problems that you anticipate for rural and smaller communities?
President MD.
So I think that the big missing discussion is a statement of the goals that you're trying to achieve with this type of immigration policy. And in a lot of the discussion even we've had this afternoon, it's sort of been about numbers, absorptive capacity, but not so much about what are we trying to achieve? Is it innovation? Is it labor supply? Is it growing the high-skilled population? But if you don't know what goal you're trying to achieve, then I don't know what we can actually recommend. Because if the goal was to bring in lower skilled labor for the short term to boost up some university finances, it was working well, and putting the cap in was probably a mistake. If the goal was long run population development and skill development, it probably needed to be more tailored to where the labor market needs. What is the innovation system you're trying to seed? But that's not the discussion we're having.
Very much, members.
Chair, I'd like
I
to
have
ask,
Mr. Morris.
thank you, Chair. Asking for unanimous consent from colleagues for a minute and a half of questions.
All in favor? All good. So I will give Mr. Morris 1.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. Professor Worswick, wanted to share with you why this is of particular interest to me. You shared earlier that when the temporary resident population went from 786,000 to 3 million, you called that going off the rails. In my community, there's a college that has raised their population of international students from 760 some odd to over 30,000 within a decade. And so that has had significant impacts in my community. You spoke about the ability to absorb. The ability of my community to absorb that population growth has been challenged. My question for you, over a year ago, I put forward a number of measures that I've been able to work with the minister on. Some of them have been put forward. A number haven't. And so I'm looking to continue to build support for these. I'd like to put one of those to you, and that is to have designated learning institutions that have more than 15% of international students who never actually enroll in a course, that there would be maybe a limiting of visas from IRCC to those DLIs. That's something that a number of countries have already done around the world. Canada hasn't yet. Is that something that's on your radar already? And is there a comment you'd like to share with the committee on a proposal like that?
Quan.
It seems like a very good idea to me. I think there's a real concern that our international student program at times is turning into a de facto temporary foreign worker program, which is not the intent. So I would support what you've told me about it anyway.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the committee members, I want to thank Professor Emery, Professor Worswick, and Mr. Corre for your input to the committee members here. Thank you. With that, very best to you. And I want to thank the honorable members for staying a bit late today, and the staff, of course, the interpreters and Mr. Clerk and the technical support. Thank you very much. With that, I will see you next Thursday.